He fired me while I was on vacation. He forgot I knew everything. I spent almost 4 years at that company building something from nothing. And in the end, what I built is exactly what brought it all down. The firm was a mid-sized IT consulting and staffing business, roughly 80 employees, placing tech workers at client sites across the country. When I joined straight out of college as a junior HR coordinator, the place was a mess. Personnel files were incomplete. I-9 forms were missing or filled out incorrectly. There was no centralized system for tracking visa expiration dates. I spent my entire first year rebuilding the HR documentation infrastructure from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous work, but I took real pride in it, and I was good at it. The founder had started the company in the 90s and was slowly stepping back from day-to-day operations. He was hands-off, which suited me fine. The trouble began when he brought in a new operations director to run things in his place. I'll call him Rick. Rick was in his mid-40s, recently divorced, drove an expensive car, and carried himself like the most important person in every room he walked into. He was neither the smartest nor the most charming person there, but he seemed genuinely convinced he was both. I later learned he'd been quietly pushed out of his previous job at a larger staffing firm. The owner apparently didn't dig deeply enough into that. From his very first week, Rick made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't immediately put into words. He found reasons to stop by my desk several times a day, even though his office was on the other side of the building. He stood too close when we spoke. He made comments about my appearance every single morning, framed as compliments, while looking me up and down. One occurrence is nothing. Every day, from your direct supervisor, is something else entirely. About a month in, he asked me to lunch to discuss department restructuring. Within 10 minutes, it was clear this had nothing to do with work. He asked whether I was seeing anyone, what I did on weekends, whether I liked wine, because he knew a great wine bar downtown. I kept steering us back to professional topics. He kept steering us back to personal ones. At the end of the meal, he leaned across the table and said, "People who work closely together and have a real connection shouldn't fight it. It only makes the working relationship harder." I told him I appreciated the lunch, but I preferred to keep work and personal life separate. He smiled and said, "We'll see." Like my answer was a negotiating position, not a boundary. Like persistence alone would eventually wear me down. That one exchange told me everything I needed to know about Rick. I said no to him, calmly and professionally, multiple times over the months that followed. Each time I did, the professional relationship got a little colder. Tasks I'd handled independently for years suddenly required his sign-off. He began copying himself on all my emails. He questioned my work publicly, in front of colleagues, for no legitimate reason. Once I sent out a routine benefits enrollment reminder, identical to the ones I'd sent for 2 years prior, and he called me into his office to tell me the tone was unprofessional and that all communications needed to go through him going forward. I recognized it for what it was, retaliation. Textbook. But I didn't report it. The owner was largely absent. Rick had his full backing. And as the person who essentially was the HR department, I had nowhere to go. What I did instead was document everything. Every inappropriate comment, every after-hours message, every shift in how I was treated after I declined his advances. I kept screenshots. I kept a data journal. When you spend enough time in HR, documentation becomes instinct. Now I need to explain something about what I was witnessing on the business side of things, because it matters enormously to what came later. A significant portion of our consulting business relied on H-1B workers, foreign nationals brought over on employer-sponsored visas to fill specialized tech roles at client sites. Under federal law, when a company sponsors an H-1B employee, it must file a labor condition application with the Department of Labor declaring the worker's salary. That salary must meet or exceed the prevailing wage for the position in that geographic area. This is not a guideline. It is a legal requirement. I processed payroll and maintained personnel files. I saw the LCA filings. I also saw the actual paychecks. The numbers didn't match. According to the government filings, our H-1B employees were earning between $85,000 and $110,000 annually depending on role and location. What they were actually being paid, based on the payroll records I handled, was between $55,000 and $70,000. The gap was not marginal, and it was not accidental. I'd first noticed this discrepancy about 2 years into my tenure, well before Rick arrived. I brought it to the owner's attention. He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, telling me the salary figures were structured differently due to housing allowances and other benefits that supposedly bridged the gap. It didn't sit right with me, but I was young, relatively new to the working world, and he was the owner. I let it go. When Rick took over operations, the situation got worse. New H-1B hires came in at even lower actual salaries. The LCA filings reported higher and higher prevailing wages, while the gap between what was declared to the government and what was paid to workers continued to grow. Meanwhile, the company was billing clients upward of $150 an hour for these same consultants. The money was flowing in. It was not flowing to the employees. I kept quiet about it, and I want to be honest about why. I was already being retaliated against for declining my supervisor's advances. If I'd raised alarms about federal violations, I would have been out the door before I finished speaking. And the H-1B workers themselves had no real recourse. Their immigration status was directly tied to their employment. If they were terminated, their visas would be revoked and they'd be forced to leave the country. The company was well aware of this dynamic and used it deliberately. I once overheard Rick on the phone telling a consultant who had asked about his compensation that he should be grateful for the opportunity, that there were plenty of people back home who would love to be in his position. It turned my stomach. But I waited. I knew the right moment would come. I suspected Rick would be the one to create it. He did, while I was on vacation. I had booked 10 days off months in advance. The time was approved in writing. My coverage was arranged. Everything was properly documented. I flew out on a Saturday, and by Monday I was making my first real attempt to decompress in over a year. On Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. It was one of the office administrators, speaking in a near whisper. She told me that Rick had called an all-hands meeting that morning and announced that my position was being eliminated due to restructuring, effective immediately. Someone was already boxing up my desk. She said Rick had told the staff my performance had been declining for months, and the decision had been made at the executive level. A few colleagues had pushed back and asked questions. Rick had shut them down. She added that he'd seemed almost gleeful about the whole thing. One of the consultants, someone I'd helped navigate his visa renewal, had asked what happened to me, saying I'd been good at my job. Rick's response, apparently, was, "People aren't always what they seem." That comment made my blood boil more than the termination itself. I spent the remainder of my trip in my hotel room, thinking, because here's what Rick apparently didn't stop to consider. He had just fired the one person who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. I didn't act impulsively when I got home. I sat with it for a few days, thinking through my options carefully. Part of me wanted to simply move on, find another job, close this chapter, and start fresh. Confrontation has never come naturally to me. But every time I opened a job listing, I thought about those H-1B workers. People who were being paid tens of thousands less than what the federal government was told they earned. People who couldn't complain, couldn't organize, couldn't walk away, because their right to remain in this country depended entirely on staying in the good graces of an employer who was exploiting that vulnerability on purpose. And then I thought about Rick, sitting in his office, smug, already spinning the narrative about why the previous person didn't work out. Moving on wasn't going to be enough. My first call was to an employment attorney. She listened to everything, the harassment, the retaliation, the termination during an approved vacation with no documented performance issues, and told me I had a strong wrongful termination case. When I told her about the H-1B wage situation, she went quiet for a moment. Then she told me I needed to contact the Department of Labor. So I did. I filed a detailed complaint with the Dole's Wage and our division. I laid out the discrepancies between the LCA filings and the actual wages paid, the approximate number of affected workers, and the timeline. I no longer had access to the company's files, but 4 years of handling that paperwork had left me with enough specific knowledge, dates, structures, patterns, to point investigators in exactly the right direction. My attorney also helped me navigate the immigration fraud angle. Filing false information on visa applications is federal fraud, and there are agencies that take it very seriously. There were a lot of forms and phone calls, but the reporting got done. Then I settled in and waited. In the meantime, Rick had tried to contest my unemployment claim, arguing I'd been terminated for cause. Since there was zero documentation in my file, no write-ups, no performance improvement plans, nothing, because my performance had genuinely been excellent, the challenge was denied. It was a small victory, but a satisfying one. A few weeks after I filed my complaints, a former colleague texted me. 2 people in suits had arrived at the office with paperwork and spent most of the day in the conference room with Rick and the owner. They left carrying boxes of files. Rick, she said, had been visibly shaken for the rest of the week, short-tempered, staying behind a closed office door. The confidence was gone. He looked, she told me, like a completely different person. More updates followed. Several H-1B consultants had been contacted individually and asked to provide their pay stubs and employment contracts. The mood in the office had shifted entirely. People were nervous, quietly updating their resumes. Rick had tried to hold a company-wide meeting to assure everyone it was a routine audit. Nobody believed him. Routine audits don't end with investigators walking out carrying boxes. The Department of Labor opened a full investigation. They pulled payroll records, visa filings, tax documents, and employment contracts. They interviewed current and former H-1B employees, many of whom, once they understood they were victims, not targets, were forthcoming. I received a call from someone at the DOL asking me to clarify details from my original complaint. It was a brief conversation. They asked about specific dates and file locations. They clearly already had a solid handle on what they were looking for. On the employment side, my attorney made short work of the company's legal defense. They claimed my termination was part of a legitimate restructuring. She pointed out that no other positions had been eliminated, and that someone had been hired to perform essentially my exact job 3 weeks after I was let go. They claimed I had performance issues. She produced my last 3 performance reviews, all rated exceeds expectations or above. They had nothing. We settled. I'm not disclosing the exact amount, but it was sufficient to cover my legal fees, eliminate my remaining student loan debt, and provide a comfortable financial cushion while I searched for new work. That, however, was the smaller story. The federal investigation revealed that over a 5-year period, the company had underpaid its H-1B workers by a cumulative total of more than $2 million. The gap between what was reported to the government and what was actually deposited into workers' accounts was not the result of accounting errors. It was a deliberate scheme. When DOL investigators dug further into the financial records, they found something worse. The wage differential, the money that should have gone to employees, had been classified as consulting fees paid to a separate LLC. That LLC was controlled by Rick. He had been routing the stolen wages through a shell company and not reporting the income properly. Rick was charged on multiple federal counts covering the visa fraud, the wage theft, and the tax violations related to the shell company. The owner, whose original practices had laid the groundwork for the scheme before Rick arrived and expanded it, was also implicated. He took a plea deal in exchange for cooperation and a reduced sentence. Rick did not fare as well. He was convicted and received a prison sentence. The company itself was hit with substantial DOL penalties and effectively banned from sponsoring foreign workers, which, for a business whose entire model depended on placing H-1B consultants, was a death sentence. Clients began pulling contracts as word of the federal investigation spread. No one wanted that kind of association. The company shut down entirely. 80 people lost their jobs. I won't pretend that part doesn't weigh on me. But I also know that a company built on the systematic exploitation of vulnerable workers is not a company that deserved to survive. The H-1B employees who had been underpaid for years were connected with legal resources to protect and adjust their immigration status. As for me, I found a new position. Better company, better compensation, better leadership. A manager who has never once commented on my appearance or implied that my career advancement depended on my personal availability to him. I'm doing well. I want to be clear about one thing. When Rick fired me, I was not trying to destroy the company. I was trying to hold one man accountable for what he had done to me. But when you spend years running a federal fraud scheme and then terminate the one employee who witnessed all of it, in the most brazen and vindictive way possible, you shouldn't be surprised when it unravels. Rick didn't lose everything because I made a phone call. Rick lost everything because of choices he made over years, which he compounded by making me his enemy. I just made sure the right people heard about it. 2 shorter stories follow. The new hire who wouldn't be trained by a teenager. When I was 17, I worked summer data entry for my grandparents on a Texas oil farm where my grandfather was the foreman. Part of my job was walking new hires through required OSHA safety training, putting in the instructional videos and confirming completion. It was standard company procedure, fully compensated time. One new hire came in who had no safety training on record. When I explained he'd be spending the next day or two in my office completing the required videos, he erupted. He wasn't going to be told what to do by a little girl dash, he said. I went to my grandfather, who was also my direct supervisor, and explained what had happened. His response, dash, you want to fire him. My grandfather followed me back to my office and stood in the doorway while I, at 17 years old, told a grown man to collect his things and leave. He began causing a scene, until he noticed the holster on my grandfather's hip. He went quiet, and then he left. It remains one of the most satisfying moments of my professional life. Let her finish. I work in a field where we evaluate foreign educational credentials, reviewing academic programs completed abroad and writing comparative reports. A colleague recently challenged one of my reports in front of our supervisor, implying I'd made an error. Had she read the underlying documentation, she would have seen that I was correct. The applicant had completed 10 years of schooling before entering the program, not the 12 years required for the credential she was questioning. I said nothing. I let her bring our manager into it. She ended up explaining her concern out loud, at which point it became clear she hadn't read the requirements, and our supervisor asked her, plainly, why she was reviewing my work instead of completing her own. There's an old saying, never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. I've found it holds up.